we have this enormous gap between what people expect, the kind of expectations that are set by the Amazons of the world, and then what organizations are actually able to deliver. Marketers a lot of time will kind of come in and try to fill that gap by means of brand, design, copy, but what they tend to ignore are the more technical aspects of that. They need to work hand in hand with product teams, with IT teams. Business people have to learn how to clearly articulate. Today, we're going to do a special episode of the Everything Clicks podcast. Don't worry, it's not going to be your typical 1980s special episode. And no, rather what we're going to do is answer some of your questions that have come in from our audience over the past few months of episodes. Let's go ahead and get started. Our first question that came in, I thought was a good one. What blind spots do you see when organizations try to bridge the gap between customer experience and their expectations? And I thought that was a good one because that's really kind of a theme of the show, right? That we have this enormous gap between what people expect, the expectations that are in the marketplace, the kind of expectations that are set by the Amazons of the world, and then what organizations are actually able to deliver. And I think the challenge there, that blind spot that people don't see is marketers a lot of time will kind of come in and try to fill that gap by means of brand, design, copy, all of which are things that are super important. But what they tend to ignore are the more technical aspects of that. And the fact that they need to work hand in hand with product teams, with IT teams in order to fill that gap. That business people have to learn how to clearly articulate what it is they're looking for, what the end goal or end state is. And then from that, develop good specifications and good requirements that can be provided to the IT team to say, okay, this is the experience we need to build. Or a lot of times, not even so much this is the experience we need to build, it really becomes more of an issue of this is the functionality we need to create, the capabilities that we need to create within the experience, because the experience is going to depend a lot on data, on what your customers are expressly saying they want, either by means of their behavior, the information you have about your customers in your CRM or in your data warehouse or any other repository that you have for that customer data. So really, it's going to be about saying IT, product, they're our partners at the table, and we all have to sit at the table and figure this problem out together. It can't be a situation where you as a business person, as a marketer, try to figure this and solve this in a vacuum or in a silo, and then simply come back and dictate to product or IT teams, okay, this is exactly what I need you to do. It needs to be a partnership. And I think that is the biggest blind spot, the biggest point of contention, the biggest challenge we see in people trying to meet customer expectations and creating those capabilities within the organization. So great question. Thank you for posting that one. All right, let's look at another one. It says here, I believe in the post-click experience, which is good, like that. But how could I demonstrate its importance to my boss and show him that this is where real conversion happens? I mean, there's a couple of ways to do that. Just using kind of a basic story of how your boss probably shops. Perhaps your boss saw an ad online for something. Maybe they saw an ad during a streaming some content, whatever the case might happen to be. That ad is not what convinced them to buy. That ad is what convinced them to investigate that product or service in the first place. It's what moved them to say, I'm going to go to this brick and mortar store. It's what moved them to say, I'm going to go to this website. I'm going to go to this app and visit. But the information they got to allow them to make that decision about if they were going to buy, and if so, what they were going to buy, happened post-click. It happened after the interaction with that ad. It happened when they got to the website, they began to consume the information, they began to read up on the different product offerings, maybe do some searching around, maybe read some reviews or testimonials, maybe look at different ratings. All those things happened, were helping that person make that decision. And then even when that happened, how much friction did they run into in actually going through and making the decision? Let's say they make the decision and say, okay, I want to buy product X. Well, as they start clicking through and going through, was it easy for them to see, okay, this is where I enter my credit card information. This is where I enter my address. This is where I choose my shipping options. Because the longer it takes for that to happen, the more friction, the more time it takes, the more likely someone is to bail because we have things to do. You're shopping and you're trying to buy something real quick between phone calls at work. Just like in a store, you may be stopping by on the store on the way home to grab something real quick at the grocery store, and then you end up leaving the grocery store to get back home because you have to make dinner, or you have to take the kids to soccer practice, or whatever the case happens to be. The amount of time that takes greatly impacts you. I've gone to the store. I've stopped by the grocery store to grab something real quick when I had an appointment to go to. And if I get there, I find my product and there's only 3 lines open at the checkout counter, and those lines are all 20 people long, I'm leaving. I'm going to take what I have, I'm going to put it on the nearest shelf, and I'm leaving the store, because that was the point of friction that didn't allow me to complete the conversion point. And again, that all happened after the interaction with the advertising. At this point, I knew exactly what product I want. I was sold on the product, but the experience of actually purchasing the product created enough friction, enough of a barrier, that I wasn't able to complete the purchase. So that decision component of it, where people actually decide what it is they are or aren't going to buy, and then that actual going through that conversion process, all that happens post-click. And those kind of 2 big critical pieces are the ones that take all the time and the energy. That's where the fear happens. That's where the uncertainty, that's where the doubt comes into place. All these psychological factors that play on us as we're making these decisions, whether they're impulse decisions or even high consideration purchases. So that's definitely one way to attack it, is just to kind of create that story. But if that doesn't work, analytics will tell you. Analytics will tell you exactly how much traffic you're driving from an ad. So you're driving 100,000 clicks, 100,000 visitors are coming from advertising. But of that 100,000, 1,000 of them are buying. So here the ad has done its job, it's driven someone, but something happened between the time that that person clicked on the ad and the time that they bought that said 99% of those people said, I'm not going through with a purchase. That's the post-click experience. It's that 99%. And that's the thought that the metrics really communicate very clearly and unambiguously to your boss or to anyone else and executives who aren't buying into the importance of that. So you're investing all this money to get those 100,000 people a month to the site, but then you're not investing nearly as much money to say, how do we convert 99% of them that aren't doing what we wanted them to do? We spent the money for them to do it, and 99% of them aren't doing it. That's a problem that needs to be solved. And that's the importance of the post-click experience. So really good question there. How do you balance hyper-personalization with limited resources? That's a really good one, because that is challenging. Personalization is super important today. And I think the key to that question, which is, it's interesting that the way that this person worded it, hyper-personalization, because hyper-personalization is very much not something that you get to with a light switch. It's going to be a journey. There's a bit of a crawl, walk, run approach to real, true hyper-personalization, and you're not going to get there tomorrow. So really, with limited resources, I would just start with personalization on a super high level. Just find those high buckets of personalization. Can I personalize based on whether or not the person has or hasn't been to the site before? Can I personalize on where the person's coming from? Can I personalize on what ad that person clicked on? So what is this explicit or implicit information you have about this person that doesn't really require a whole lot of work on your part to understand? And then based on your product or service, what is that information telling me about that person that's going to be relevant to their experience? So let's take, for example, something as simple as, has the person been on our site before or not? Well, if they have been in there before, then what did they look at? What was it that they searched for? What was it that they visited? What products did they view? So that's information that you can now surface back to that person, and that's a personalized experience. They are seeing something based on their past behavior. It's personal to them. Whereas maybe a new site visitor, you're more worried about, well, I don't know anything except maybe where they came from. So if I know what ad brought them to it, what was the ad advertising? What was the product? What was the service? What was the messaging in that ad? Was there a promotion? Was there an emotional hook? In which case, how do I then mirror that promotional message, that emotional hook to that person now that they're on the site? That's personalization. In travel, we see a lot of geographic personalization, because a lot of times where the person is will help communicate maybe what products we should advertise to that person. People in certain parts of countries or certain parts of the world tend to have greater propensities to visit maybe some of your products and their destinations. So highlighting those particular destinations is personalization. Now, is that one-to-one personalization? No, because you're aggregating everyone that's coming from the Northeast United States. You're aggregating everyone who came from this particular ad, right? You're aggregating everyone who looked at this particular product page or PDP. But it is a stepping stone into personalization. Then you start to layer on top of that and say, okay, I know this person is coming from the Northeast United States and they clicked on this ad and they're a returning visitor. Well, now you have three different things that you can use to personalize their experience. And when you start to do that and you start to layer over time, now you're getting closer and closer and honing in closer to that one-on-one. Now you're getting that hyper personalization. So simply creating a roadmap to get you there and saying, this is going to be my starting point. These are going to be different things I try and test and see what does or doesn't work. And then I'm going to say, I'm going to take a couple of those things and I'm going to combine them and see how that works. And then I'm going to take another element. I'm going to layer that on top. I'm going to see how that works. And road mapping that out gives you a step-by-step process that's going to be a lot easier to handle with limited resources than if you try to kind of take on the enormous elephant that is hyper-personalization in your first kind of swing. It's going to likely be a swing and a miss. And then you're going to be disappointed and people are going to be upset that you spend time on this. You're not going to get the kind of buy-in you're looking for. So that's one way to kind of do that. This is a really good one. We've talked about this a couple of times in the pod now. It says, you've mentioned how most experiments fail, which in my experience creates fear to try them in the first place. How do you reframe failure as learning for leadership teams? So experimentation is really one of those things that you can't look at in a vacuum. You can't look at it from the standpoint of just this one experiment, what happened. You have to kind of look at it very much from a process standpoint, right? So to use kind of a simple sports analogy, nobody hits 100%. No one shoots 100%, right? Misses are necessary in order to get makes. So the same is true when it comes to marketing. Misses are necessary in order to make shots, in order to hit the ball, so to speak. So one of the things that we do when we try to introduce people to experimentation is initially we'll lead and we'll tell them, hey, this was a miss. This was a failed experiment. Then we'll say, but this experiment taught us this. So for example, we tried to test X. X told us that, hey, this particular variation didn't work, but it taught us an important lesson. And the lesson was that this particular point in the experience was extremely important. It was impactful to the person. So what's another way that we can come at this experience? Let's apply maybe some psychological factors to that. So then we go to experiment Y and we tried Y. Y worked tremendously. So we might not have gotten to experiment Y had we not tried X and had that be a loss and a failure because X told us something that was important. We honed in on that particular portion of the experience. We executed Y. Y was the one that ended up moving the business. So you can't look at it in a vacuum. You very much need to position it as a story. And just like any story, there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. It's a journey. It's not over in one page. So make sure that as you're talking about experimentation and as you're introducing it, don't introduce it as like this one test at a time and this one test. Aggregate things together and kind of show how this combination of efforts of testing, of research, of data analytics and so forth, all these things kind of came together to be able to ultimately deliver what you wanted to deliver to the customer. And that is going to be the way that you help convince and say, hey, look, this isn't about failures. This is about learnings. This is what we learned. And then this is how we've put the learning into action to actually drive what needed to happen, which was, of course, getting a new customer. Another one about experimentation. It mentions here, what are key elements of building an experimentation culture that goes beyond just running A/B tests? That's a really good one because, and I'm guilty of this too, I kind of use the word experimentation and A/B testing interchangeably, and those aren't the same thing, really. Experimentation is a bigger, broader cultural mindset, right? It's really a mindset of saying, how do we look at things from a more iterative standpoint? Think about it as kind of like a lean thinking mindset of where we're coming up with a viable product, we're putting it in the marketplace, we're getting feedback. And one of the ways you get feedback is via A/B testing, but that's just one of the ways you get feedback. User research is another means to get feedback. Looking at experience analytics is another way to get feedback. Doing small focus groups is another way to get feedback. So A/B testing is definitely an accurate means by which to get feedback, but it's just a subset of a bigger experimentation culture. And you could come at it a couple of different ways. You can certainly try to establish the culture within the organization. And then from that will come all these different methodologies and methods of being able to learn and iterate. But probably the more realistic way, if you don't already have that culture in your organization, is going to be to start with something small like A/B testing or like doing some research. And then using that as a means by which to say, hey, you see how great this is and how powerful this is? Awesome. Let's now kind of expand upon this. And now you're teaching people the power and the impact of an experimentation culture. And now you're kind of starting to spread that gospel of the culture throughout the organization. And that's probably going to be an easier way to do it because now you're kind of using small wins to build momentum. And people are starting to buy in. And once you start to kind of get that yes momentum, people start to commit. You get that level of consistency when people commit. That's just basic psychology again, and kind of using that psychology to begin to kind of spread that gospel of experimentation throughout the organization. So start small, find elements of research, of feedback, of A/B testing that people can kind of buy into, that they can see the impact of, tell that story, and then try to grow and expand upon that story. And by doing that, spread the gospel of experimentation. But that all being said, it's really important that you get executive sponsorship. You really need to get executive buy-in in order for this to happen. You've got to have leadership play a vital role in saying, this is how we're going to begin to think about things, and this is the way we're going to start doing things, because people are going to do what's important to the leaders. That's just what we all do. Because when it all comes down to it, we care about customers, and that's important. That's great. We care about the business, and that's great. But in the end, we care about ourselves. Like we're doing the job not because we tend to be super invested in the success of the organization. We do the job because we're trying to get a paycheck and we're trying to pay our bills and pay our mortgage and raise our kids and do those things. And ultimately, that tends not to be driven realistically by what happens in the organization. It tends to be driven by what's important to our boss. So if we really want an experimentation culture, that's got to be important to the bosses. It's got to be important at the executive level. So getting that sponsorship is going to be key, finding that person who really sees that. So maybe you start to make those little small wins we talked about. And maybe your goal is just to convince this one person. It's to convince the CMO or the CRO or the chief product officer, whoever that might happen to be. And once you kind of get their buy-in, now you have that sponsor, now you have that executive evangelist that can help you to kind of now begin to spread that gospel the way you want to. So it's definitely tricky, but it's definitely possible. A lot of organizations have done it and been successful at it. So thank you very much for asking that question as well. How do you help companies move from ad hoc testing to more systematic experimentation programs? Oh, that's a good one as well. We talked about it. I talked about it in answering a previous question. It really comes down to having a roadmap. You need some structure and process and framework in order to be able to move things forward and get from ad hoc testing. So you've got to say, how are we capturing testing ideas? How are ideas even being generated in the first place so that you have a bit of a pipeline of ideas? And then how do we move those ideas into different phases? How do we take that idea and create an hypothesis? How do we take that hypothesis and begin to design that experiment? How do we take that experiment and then in that design, and then how do we build that? Then how long are we running the experiment? And then what's our process for analyzing the results of the experiment? And then what are the learnings? And then how do we communicate and evangelize those learnings? So having that structure and process is just like running a campaign, right? You have the pieces and parts of the campaign that you know you need to deploy an email or start advertising a new promotion or wherever the case is. And those processes you have in place that allow you to begin to consistently say, we send emails multiple times a week, or, we run promotions every month, or wherever the case may be. So in the same instance, experimentation needs to have a structure and a process. Without that, you're just kind of going through your other processes and kind of saying, oh, maybe we inject experimentation in here at some point or another. And then you're just leaving it to chance and it's ad hoc, as opposed to saying, here are all the things we want to test. Here are the sources of these ideas. Here's how we're prioritizing this. And then here's how we're moving it phase by phase by phase. So having that structure and processes out there, there's all kinds of resources that help with that. We have a particular structure and a resource that we call RITA to do that. It's about research, ideation, testing, and analysis. And that just really identifies kind of the four major buckets of doing that. You want to start with research. You want feedback from the customer to really be driving ideation, because those ideas have the highest likelihood of having a positive impact, because now it's not just subjective. This is what someone thought in the shower that morning. It's really about saying, hey, this is what our customers are saying to us. So research is one. That research leads to ideation. So now you need to take those ideas, document them, prioritize them, and say, what are we working on first? Then testing, okay, that's where we create the hypothesis, we design the test, we build the test, and then finally, of course, analysis, saying what were the results of the test, what did we learn from this? So if you can break down a process into those four buckets, those 4 steps, as it were, that read process, that's fundamentally what you want to doing. And that's a relatively straightforward and easy way to kind of get going when it comes to testing and move from ad hoc to be more systematic as your question posed. So thank you, whoever asked that one. So this is one we actually talked about a little bit earlier. It says, how do you navigate the disconnect between marketing, product, and IT teams when implementing post-quick experience or PCX initiatives? So we talked a little bit earlier in a previous question about the importance of making sure that everyone's at the table. So you want to have marketing, product, and IT all sitting at the table together, coming up with solutions. What you don't want is marketing coming in the door and kind of saying, I have already solutioned this. Here are your marching orders. Go execute this and go do this. That's not alignment. That's just being bossy. And just in general, whether you're in a kindergarten or you're an adult, like no one kind of likes that. So, being collaborative is the best way to kind of do this. So marketing, product, IT, all sitting together at the table, all coming together and saying, what's our process going to be for doing these things? How does that process impact each of our departments? How do we make sure we have the appropriate information and requirements across the board and that we're meeting those? What are our checkpoints to make sure that we're not kind of getting out of sync when it comes to meeting those requirements? How do we make sure that we're iterating, that we're not kind of biting off more than we can chew at the beginning, but we're looking at maybe a minimal viable product and what we're trying to execute, and then we're learning, and then we're iterating and growing and moving this thing forward? Those are all kind of key elements to doing that. And a lot of that will speak very strongly, especially to the product team, because they tend to think in lean and kind of lean thinking kind of methodology. And from an IT perspective, it's all about specifications and requirements. Like that's what they want. They want a very clear blueprint of what's going to happen. And when they're involved in the blueprint, it becomes a lot clearer to them. The picture just becomes a lot clearer to them because they're really about empowering capabilities, not necessarily trying to create very specific, very stringent use cases. So understanding the problem, being at the table, talking about it and articulating it is going to put them in a position to say, okay, these are the capabilities you need. Here's how we can empower those capabilities. Here's how you can use those capabilities. Again, product, how do we create an MVP of this? Then how do we begin to learn, iterate, and make those changes and kind of keep ourselves nimble moving forward? So that's really the key. It's just kind of making sure everyone kind of speaks each other's language, so to speak. It's no different than kind of negotiating peace, between different countries. You want to speak each other's languages. You want to understand what's important to the other group and come at it from that perspective because, as we mentioned, people look for their own self-interest. And coming at it from that perspective is going to bring that kind of peace. It's going to bring that kind of harmony. Now you're able to get some semblance of détente between your 3 different groups, rather. You're all able to sit at the table and you're able to kind of hammer something out that can work. You start small and you work your way moving forward. So that's probably the best advice I can give there to kind of expound on what we talked about earlier. And here's one we hear a lot. We have a ton of questions, but we'll do these again if you guys like these episodes. What role should AI play in customer experience optimization? And that's a big one because, of course, AI is such a huge one. Honestly, that's kind of a loaded question to answer because AI can play several different roles when it comes to experience optimization. So let's just kind of talk about a few of what those roles can be. And actually, what we'll do is we'll use that same framework. We'll use that RITA framework around experimentation, so research, ideation, testing, and analysis to kind of talk about the role that AI can play. This isn't the only framework that we can use to talk about this, but it's one that we can use today that might be helpful. So from a research perspective, AI certainly, if properly targeted, can do a lot of research for you. But another great use case for AI is helping to analyze research. So if you have robust research you've already done in the past as your organization, if you're currently doing research, if you're getting customer feedback, if you have certain MIDI experience analytics tools like Content Squares of the world, a lot of those tools either have AI built into them that you can leverage to get faster analysis and say, what are the key insights and learnings I should be getting from this? Or you can take that research and kind of dump it into a GPT or another tool and be able to say, tell me, act as a market researcher, tell me what are the things that are really important here. And as you do that, when you're using those tools, be explicit in your prompts. Say, you're telling the prompt to act as a particular expert. Tell the prompt about your company, what's important to your company, what the company does, In other words, give the prompt context. Don't just kind of let it run rampant. Give the prompt context, because the more context you give the prompt, the better the results are going to be and more useful to you. So giving those prompts context is super important. So that's a couple of ways that you can use it in research. Then kind of taking that same information, you can use that from an ideation standpoint and kind of say, hey, using this research and comparing that to my site, this experience, what opportunities are there to be able to experiment. Again, some of these tools will also give you recommendations for ideas for experimentation. Some of them had agents that will even create A/B tests for you and run those tests for you, either from a website standpoint or maybe from a marketing automation standpoint. So those are great. We had an episode that talked a little bit about that. And I think it was Blue Shift had some of those capabilities. So another use case there for AI is great. And then when you're actually doing the testing and analysis, again, AI kind of looking for and surfacing some of those key metrics is so important. And I think, as marketers, we really are interested in the creative kind of ideation, kind of, more fun aspects of our role and as our job as marketers. We're not necessarily often as interested in the more technical or the more analytical aspects of it. So AI becomes a great friend because AI can handle the more analytical aspects of it while we get to do the more fun stuff. But again, AI really, really, really needs to be given context. I can't stress that enough. Just simply plopping something into an AI and giving it a very, very vague instructions is not going to be the way to get the best results. You've got to give it structure. You've got to give it context. You got to give it a story because it's going to be a lot more powerful when you give it some parameters to use as opposed to letting it kind of create its own parameters where you're not going to get something as useful or as accurate, frankly, by doing that. So giving it that context can be very helpful in using those prompts to help move things through, as well as some of those AI tools and functionalities that a number of MarTech stacks have nowadays. So that's another great way to use AI. So this one actually has to do with lifecycle marketing, which I've talked about a lot on the pod as well. This is, how do you measure long-term customer lifetime value rather than just immediate conversion metrics? And that's a hard one to answer only because it really depends on your organization and how your organization captures that data and how it's stored. So if the organization is capturing all that historical data in a data lake or even in a CRM, then that's going to be significantly easier to get to, as opposed to maybe that information being stored in disparate systems. But as long as your organization is kind of organizing and structuring that data by customer, some unique ID of the customer that you can look up as a record in the CRM or has a particular field in the data warehouse or data lake, then as long as it's keeping track of all those different purchases and interactions that person's having, then of course you're able to use that and leverage that to analyze the lifetime value of that person or begin to analyze the lifetime value of people in aggregate. So looking at particular segments of people and analyzing their lifetime value. It's a relatively straightforward exercise if the data is structured correctly. When it becomes challenging for organizations is when they don't have the data being structured in an easy to use way. So if you have an issue where someone says to you, I can't get a good view of customer lifetime value, then for a second, take that question, put that to the side, and now let's have a conversation about data and how the data is architected and how it's structured and how we're storing that data. What is the process that we need to go through, and exercise we need to go through to improve our processes around capturing and storing data at the customer level? Do we need to establish a data lake or a data warehouse? Who's the partner we need to do that? Do we need to put a CRM into place? Do we need to get the CRM talking to the data warehouse? Do we need a CDP? Right? So it could be a technology issue. It could be a process issue, but keep the conversation focused on data and customer data specifically and getting that clean and structured. And once you do that, now you'll be able to have a much, much easier conversation about customer lifetime value. And incidentally, since we've been asked about AI too here, the same thing goes for AI. A lot of times the issue isn't so much, oh, we don't have enough use cases for AI, because there's all kinds of use cases for AI. The issue is we don't have the data to point the AI at to tell it what to do because the data isn't structured properly. So stop whatever you're doing. If you don't have good structured data, have that data conversation, engage in that data project, figure out what needs to happen there. And once you have that, your options just open up. Your options explode when you have properly and solid restructured data to be able to work with. So that's really the main message there. have the data conversation first. Then you can have the customer lifetime value conversation, the AI conversation, or whatever conversation you want to have, because now you have something to work with. You have a solid foundation on which to build upon. So that's the important thing there. We hope you guys liked this episode. Hope you enjoyed us being able to answer these questions. Hope we were able to get through maybe some of your questions in this. If not, we'll try to do them again in the future. But until then, thank you for listening and thank you for being watchers of the pod.